Deep within the forgotten corners of the world, shrouded in an eternal mist, lay Blackwood Forest. The trees, gnarled and ancient, twisted towards the sky like skeletal fingers. Their branches, bare and brittle, scraped against each other in the wind, creating an eerie symphony of whispers and groans. A young man, Ethan, stumbled through the undergrowth, his breath catching in his throat. He was lost, hopelessly turned around by the shifting, mist-wreathed paths. The forest seemed to press in on him from all sides, the silence broken only by the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic thumping of his heart. His eyes darted nervously, searching for any sign of a landmark, a path, anything familiar in this alien landscape. Ethan swore under his breath, his anxiety growing with every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. He had heard the stories, whispered by the firelight in hushed tones. Now, lost in the heart of the woods, he wasn't so sure. A figure emerged from the swirling mist, tall and gaunt, silhouetted against the dying light. He wore a long, dark coat that billowed around him like smoke. Ethan froze, fear a cold fist around his heart. The stranger approached, his face hidden in the shadows of a wide-brimmed hat. "Lost, are you?" the stranger rasped, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the forest itself. Ethan swallowed, his mouth dry. "I seem to have lost my way," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger chuckled, a dry, brittle sound. "Follow me. I will lead you out." Ethan hesitated, a flicker of unease dancing at the edge of his mind. They walked in silence, the stranger leading Ethan deeper into the forest. The path, if it could be called that, was narrow and overgrown, twisting and turning through the dense undergrowth. The air grew colder, the mist thicker, swirling around Ethan's ankles like wraiths. Ethan tried to make conversation, to break the oppressive silence, but the stranger remained tight-lipped, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. As they walked, Ethan became aware of a faint humming sound, barely audible at first, but growing steadily louder with each step. It was a low, mournful sound, like a chorus of voices chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Ethan stopped, his blood turning to ice. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "The forest has many voices," the stranger said, his voice barely audible above the eerie humming. The stranger led Ethan to a clearing, the center of which was dominated by a sprawling, dilapidated mansion. Its once grand facade was now crumbling and overgrown, the windows dark and empty like the eyes of a corpse. "Blackwood Manor," the stranger said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Once a place of joy and laughter. Now..." He trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. Ethan stared at the manor, a shiver running down his spine. The air around it felt heavy, oppressive, as if the very walls were saturated with sorrow and despair. "What happened here?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. The stranger hesitated, his gaze fixed on the manor. "A tragedy," he finally said, his voice heavy with sadness. Ethan found himself in a dusty, cobweb-draped room illuminated by flickering candlelight. A heavy wooden table dominated the center, surrounded by chairs draped in white sheets. The stranger stood at the head of the table, his long fingers resting lightly on the surface. "We are here to commune with the spirits," he said, his voice low and resonant. Ethan watched as the stranger produced a small, ornate box from his coat pocket. He opened it, revealing a planchette on a Ouija board. "Place your fingers on the planchette," the stranger instructed. Ethan hesitated, then did as he was told. As his fingers touched the planchette, a jolt of static electricity shot up his arm. "Don't be afraid," the stranger said, his voice soothing. The planchette twitched beneath his fingertips, then began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing speed, it darted across the board, spelling out words, phrases, sentences. Ethan watched in horrified fascination as the planchette seemed to take on a life of its own, guided by an unseen hand. The messages were fragmented, disjointed, but they spoke of pain, of anger, of a desperate longing for release. Ethan felt a cold dread creep up his spine as he realized they were not alone. The room was filled with an unseen presence, a palpable darkness that seemed to press down on him, stealing his breath. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut with a deafening boom, extinguishing the candles and plunging the room into darkness. Ethan cried out, his voice swallowed by the shadows. He felt a cold hand close around his wrist, the grip like ice. "They're angry," the stranger's voice hissed in his ear, barely audible above the howling wind. "You've disturbed them. Now we must appease them." Ethan struggled against the unseen grip, fear lending him strength. Ethan stumbled back, tripping over a chair in the darkness. He fell hard, his head striking the floor with a sickening thud. He lay there for a moment, stunned, his ears ringing. When he opened his eyes, he could see nothing but inky blackness. Panic welled up inside him, choking him. He scrambled to his feet, his hands outstretched, feeling his way blindly through the darkness. He bumped into walls, furniture, his heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. He had to get out, had to find the door. But the room seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness a living, breathing entity. Then he heard it. A low growl, guttural and menacing, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. A blood-curdling scream pierced the darkness, echoing through the house. Ethan opened his eyes to see a shadowy figure illuminated by a flash of lightning. It was the stranger, his face contorted in a mask of terror, his arms flailing wildly. He was being dragged back, pulled into the darkness by something unseen. Ethan didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his only thought to escape the nightmare. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay here. The house was alive, filled with a darkness that chilled him to the bone. He ran through corridors, up staircases, his lungs burning, his legs screaming for respite. Finally, he burst through a set of double doors and out into the night. Ethan stumbled through the woods, his clothes torn, his body battered and bruised. He collapsed at the base of a familiar-looking tree. As dawn broke, he looked back towards the manor, its silhouette a dark smudge against the horizon. He had survived the night, escaped the horrors of Blackwood Manor. But the experience had changed him. He rose to his feet and began the long walk back to civilization. As he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Reaching the edge of the forest, he turned back one last time. A single window, high up in the eastern tower, glowed with a faint, ethereal light. Ethan shivered, a cold dread settling in the pit of his stomach.